the guard wants to lock up the Matan building, and I want to respect his time. I'd like to dedicate this shiur to the refuah shlema of Malka Bat Chava, the wife of a dear friend and colleague, Rabbi Meir Schweiger, who had bypass surgery and is slowly recovering, but critical. So may our learning together today be towards her refuah. What I want to start out with, the idea of this shiur is really to use daf yomi, the idea of the cycle of learning a page of Talmud a day in order to achieve two goals. One is to really do a roundup. So people who either learn the daf or don't learn the daf can see a weekly summary of some of the ideas and themes and Talmudic discussions that go on as a way of connecting to Talmud study. In addition, what I'd like to point out are often the readings, or what comes up for me as I read through stories and Agada and even discussions, many of which I think are deeply relatable. There are many pieces in the Talmud that are really reflective of our own experiences, and we're going to see some of those today. I often use a psychological literary lens when I read stories in particular, and my style in this series will be no exception. For those who end up falling in love with this idea, I will be teaching it at 10:20 as well Wednesday mornings if you're in Israel. But for now, this is going to be an 8-part series. We'll see how we do, and we're going to every week go through a week's worth of daf yomi. Okay, so by way of introduction, I just want to make you familiar with certain terminology that's going to come up. Chapter 6 is, already we're more than halfway through the tractate of Eruvin. It's a very intense tractate. It's often very technical, very mathematical, as it discusses the defining of spaces and volume and area and width. And I am not a mathematical person, so this has been challenging for me in many ways. But this chapter is talking about two primary institutions, Eruv Chatzerot and Shitufei Muva'ot. And I'm going to explain, I'm going to translate each of those, and then I'm going to describe a little bit conceptually what's going on. The law of Eruvei Chatzerot is rabbinic, right? It was enacted by the sages because essentially people live around a common courtyard. They exit into a courtyard, and really, according to biblical law, there should be no reason for them not to be able to carry in and out of their courtyard, from their courtyard into their house and back and forth. And Chazal, the rabbis, determined that really, in order for this to work as a common space, a reshut hayachid. Now, a reshut hayachid it means a private domain, and it's more or less anything enclosed with walls. So certainly, a shared courtyard is a biblical reshut hayachid. But what Chazal understood is there is a concept here. What is private space? Private space requires a certain degree of ownership, joint ownership. It's not just a mathematically defined area. It's also conceptually an area where there's joint ownership and togetherness. And so they determined that there has to be an Eruv Chatzerot, which allows us to look at all of the houses opening into the courtyard as a unified space, as a space in which everyone is joined together, which, if we zoom out for a moment, is actually quite beautiful because it requires cooperation. And we know, and the Talmud knows, because there are numerous tractates on the disagreements between neighbors, that it is not simple, even in a space in which we all share a common courtyard, for everyone to get along. And essentially, an Eruv Chatzerot requires that we all get along enough that we contribute a slice of bread, a roll of bread, and we put it into a corner of the courtyard, and we look at it as if we've all come together for a joint meal. And that allows us to carry in and out of one another's homes, in and out of the courtyard. So conceptually, it's actually very beautiful in my mind. The idea of an Eruv Chatzerot, even though everyone understands this is a rabbinic invention, but it's really continuing what I think goes on throughout the tractate, which is making people aware of how boundaries can leave who's inside the boundary, who's outside the boundary. And so Eruv Chatzerot reminds us that if we all want to be together in a courtyard, we want to carry in and out of each other's houses, we have to bring food together into this courtyard and make a clear a symbol. It's symbolic that we're all united in this space. Okay, so that's the Eruv Chatzerot. We do something simple in a similar in a shitufei mevo'ot. So let me just, what a shitufei mevo'ot is, I have various courtyards that exit into an alleyway. So I have one courtyard with 4 houses around it, another courtyard, and then on the right side, another few houses and courtyards. They all exit into this alleyway, what's called a mavoy. And again, think about our own lives. Let's think about America, because in Israel, this is not our reality. We don't think about Eruv. Everything has an Eruv. But, the back alley that many houses exit into, that's a dead end. So there's lots of running around with the bicycles and the tricycles and the scooters and the balls, or maybe there's a field that several houses abut. And so the shitufei mevo'ot requires, like the Eruv Chatzerot, for everyone who exits into this common space to contribute some sort of food item. So again, we create a shituf, we create a cooperative. So very symbolic, necessary from a halachic perspective, conceptually quite beautiful in requiring cooperation. And throughout this chapter, we're going to see that regularly there are people who either forget to join in the Eruv or the shituf mevo'ot, or deliberately refuse to. And then what happens to everyone else? And I think we can all nod and recognize that pattern of behavior when one person becomes angry at another person and refuses to participate for the common good, or more common is we forget. I forgot to send my child out with the role that is meant to be my contribution. Now Shabbat started, what do? Another interesting add-on, which we're going to see in a moment in the Mishnah, what do I do if non-Jews are living with me in a courtyard, right? That's going to be another parameter we have to consider. Does that restrict the members of the courtyard? We don't really want the non-Jew contributing a loaf of bread into this communal space. We don't want the non-Jew to be completely part of the communal space. And so we're going to require something else from the non-Jew than we require from the Jewish population sharing a courtyard or sharing an alleyway. So that's Eruv Chatzerot, Shituf Mevo'ot. Another concept is Bitul Reshut. Again, Chazal are very aware of human fallibility. Many times people will just forget to bring, send their part of the Eruv, or forget to sign up for the Shituf. And so they allowed a resident of the courtyard to just relinquish their rights to the courtyard. You could be Mavatel, Bitul Reshut. So this allows everyone else to use the courtyard and to use the Eruv, but I can't. I have now relinquished my right. I have removed myself for the greater good from the ability to use this common space. I can walk through the space. I just can't carry in and out of the space. And hopefully that will remind me next week to join the Eruv in time. But human psychology, right? It's wonderful because it's so real. We forget things all the time. And Chazal have these back doors that allow for movement, even when we are fallible, even when we forget. A non-Jew will not be allowed to relinquish his rights for a whole series of reasons. Instead, the Jews can lease the rights, schirut. They can lease rights from the idolater in their courtyard. Consistently, the non-Jew will be referred to as an idolater. There will be all sorts of negative comments made about idolaters living among us in this chapter, but also throughout the Talmud. And the last idea I want to introduce before we dive in and I go page by page with little snippets from each page is what's called Drisat Regel. Now, hold on to your hats a little bit, because the Drisat Regel is going to be challenging for us to wrap our head around. I'll try to simplify, and I'm going to bring a picture as we go through the chapter. But essentially it means if someone lives in an inner courtyard and has to pass through the outer courtyard to get to the street, because I, in the inner courtyard, must pass through the outer courtyard, I become in some ways partly affiliated with the outer courtyard. That's called drisat regel. I have a rite of passage. And if people in the inner courtyard make an eruv, and people in the outer courtyard make an eruv, and they do not make an eruv together, that's going to complicate things in terms of carrying from the inner to the outer to the street. Okay, and so I'm just throwing out these concepts. First of all, these are concepts that come up regularly in this tractate, but also throughout the Talmud. They throw in all sorts of things about Eruv and Eruvin. So you may have even grown up hearing some of this Shituf Mavo, Eruv Chatzerot. The truth is, in the Sidur, in the Koran Sidur, in the Rinat Yisrael, they have a page with the blessing to say on Eruv Chatzerot and Shituf Mavoot. We don't really do that. I mean, I don't know if anyone here has ever done it. Again, I live in a yishuv. I know the rabbi checks the eruv. If you live in a city, you rely on the rabbi to check the eruv. We don't really create eruvin. However, I know people who have gone to camps, on seminars out to space. They have to build an eruv. And so for some people, this is even today practical. Okay, what I want to start with, just to show you the Mishnah at the beginning of this chapter, and then we are going to move into some wonderful Agadita. Hold on, excuse me one moment while I find the right page. Okay, the first chapter, I'm not going to bring the pages in Gemara. 8 pages of Gemara is too much to even consider visually presenting. But what I am going to show you is the Mishnah. So Hadar im Nochri b'chatzer, really right off the bat, the first Mishnah in the chapter, one who lives in a courtyard with a non-Jew. This is a Jew who does not acknowledge the laws of Eruv, of which there are many today. Harezel seralav, divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, these are going to restrict you from using the Eruv. You will not be able to make an Eruv with these people, not with the non-Jew and not with the Jew who doesn't accept the laws of Eruv. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, he has a different position. La'olam eino oser ad shiyu shnei Yisraelim osrim zal zeh. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says no. A Jew and a non-Jew, nonsense, not a problem. The Jew can use the courtyard freely, no restrictions. If there are 2 Jews and a non-Jew, then already you have issues of Eruv, and you have to take the non-Jew into consideration. So we see here a machloket. Okay. Amar Rabban Gamliel Maaseh b'tzduki echad. Rabban Gamliel now tells us a story about a tzadukite. He is a Jew. I want to make that clear. He is not the kuti that sometimes comes up, who's not Jewish but isn't really an idolater. This is a Jew, but not a rabbinic Jew. A lot of tension between the Chazal, the rabbis, and the tzadukites, the tzadukim. So he lives in a courtyard. Shaya darimanu b'mavoy b'Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim was filled with tzedukim and prushim, everyone living side by side. Va'amar lanu abba miharu v'hotziu et kol ha'kelim l'mavoy. Ad shelo yotzi v'yasar lechem. Rabban Gamliel tells a story which is going to be unpacked more fully in the Gemara. This is all I'm going to say about the story because it's in the Mishnah. That's enough for us. But Rabban Gamliel basically says that he remembers his father saying, if you want to use the alleyway, I've already talked to the tzadukite. He doesn't believe in Eruv, because Eruv, remember, is a rabbinic invention, and the tzadukites were biblical Jews. So he's not going to join us in an Eruv, but he's agreed to relinquish his rights. I don't want to take a chance that he's going to change his mind, says Rabban Gamliel's father, and begin to use the mavoy, showing that he didn't mean the bitul. He didn't mean to relinquish his rights. Quickly, bring your vessels into the alley, and then you've preempted him before he's had a chance with his actions to show any relinquishing, any regret, and we can now use the alleyway. That was Rabban Gamliel's father's approach, how to handle the coexistence between Jews who did not accept halakha or did not accept rabbinic law, and Rabban Gamliel's father who did. This is what we can do. This is how we can make it work. Rabbi Yehuda is going to be far more stringent. Amar b'lashon acher mi'aru v'asu tzarchem b'mavoy ad shelo yotzi v'yasar lechem. Rabbi Yehuda says if he shows up on Shabbat at any time carrying items, he restricts all of us. It's over because he's relinquished his relinquishing. He's basically taken it back, and that counts. So you see 2 different models. Rabban Gamliel's father, who says we're going to coexist with the tzadukites and it's going to be fine, and we're just going to figure out a way to be mindful and preemptive and so on. And Rabbi Yehuda is saying no. If on Shabbat they show that they have recanted, It's over. We no longer can carry. Just bring everything into the alleyway so it's already there. Okay, so that's the first Mishnah. What I want to talk about now is page 63, a little bit about what's going on. We're going to go very quickly, but I hope, I'll keep it clear and as simple as possible. We're now in Agada, meaning this chapter is an excellent example of the fluidity, of the constant movement between halachic discussions and Agadic discussions and storytelling and going off on tangents at times. So right now we've gone off on a bit of a tangent. And the topic of the day, of the daf, is anyone who renders a legal decision in the presence of his teacher is liable for death. That's a really strong statement. And in fact, they bring numerous examples. Several of them have to do with a shchita knife, a knife used for ritual slaughtering, and a question whether a student can assess the kosherousness, whether a knife is kosher, whether it can be used for slaughter when his Rebbe is in town, even if it's for his own use. Now, I find these stories fascinating, and I'm going to explain why in a moment. But the story I want to tell you, a particular story, it's a story that I've taught in other contexts, is Rabbi Eliezer, who's a Tana, who has a disciple who renders a legal decision in his presence. And Rabbi Eliezer comes home and says to his wife, Ima Shalom, he is not long for this world because he has rendered a decision in front of me. And in fact, he dies shortly thereafter. And his wife, Ima Shalom, says to him, are you a Navi? Are you wow, how did you know that? And Rabbi Eliezer says, Lo Navi Anochi, Velo Ben Navi Anochi, but I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet, but I've received from my teachers, anyone who renders a legal decision in the presence of his teacher is liable to death by the hand of heaven. And for me, these stories are very interesting because there's a lot of, I perceive, right? There are several tensions here. The tension of, again, kavod, right? Respect for elders, respect for the sages, respect for the teachers. We know in any profession, the young upstarts, a young, brilliant scholar can come and overturn or upend the status and the teachings and the Torah, right, of an older scholar. And what I hear here is a little bit of the fear, what will happen, right? There has to be a hierarchy, there has to be a process. As long as the older, wiser sages are alive, they have the authority. But of course, realistically, we know that for there to be any movement and growth, we need the younger scholars. And throughout the Talmud, in fact, younger scholars often bring new voices and new interpretation into the discourse. Then they have to prove themselves and they have to bring precedent and so on. And yet, that's why these statements that anyone who renders a legal decision in the presence of his teacher is liable to death reflect to me a deep anxiety. What role does the older teacher have, the older authority, and the presence of the sage have when all of these younger students who we ourselves have trained come up through the trenches? And what bothers me about the Rabbi Eliezer story is, of course, he could have gone to talk to the disciple and said, look, this is bad behavior. Instead, he goes home and passively waits for him to die. Couldn't there be a different ending to such a scenario? On this daf, it continues also being aware of a power structure, potential for corruption. It basically says you may not give all of your gifts to one Kohen. Be aware that there are many, many priests in the society, in the community. When you have to give gifts to the priests, do not focus on one student. Hi, Leah, I see your question. The days of our lives is days, a daf a day, where I'm going to bring in points from the weekly roundup, in which I often, like even now what I'm doing, talking about issues that come up in our lives, how we live with other people, and in this case, this as people age, how do we deal with younger people who come into our profession, who come in our community, who are enthusiastic, who have energy, and yet threaten the order that we represent. And so I'm going to be teaching in that manner. It is a weekly roundup, and you're certainly welcome to talk to Matan if that's not what you expected. Further on in the daf, we have this idea again. So try to avoid corruption on the part of the priests by not focusing on only one priest. What good advice? If we think about politicians, right? It's very easy for all of our donations to go to one politician, but that can create corruption. We have to be careful of where our donations go. We have to perhaps make sure to spread some of the gifts we give so that we're not overly financing one person, giving more power. And in this case, their awareness that the priesthood can become corrupted is so I mean, the priesthood did become corrupted. And yet these are supposed to be our representatives before in the temple before God. Says a lot about, even within religion, hierarchy, power, leadership. And this is coming right after the statements about anyone who renders a legal decision in the presence of his teacher is liable to death, which itself creates a hierarchy and itself doesn't allow for too much self-critique and self-discipline. So notice that you bring two ideas that almost contradict each other. Try to avoid corruption by building up any one power base, but what about in the academy? What about giving too much power, too much authority to the older sages? Maybe the checks and balances actually come when younger sages come in. And so I'm bringing that to your attention. Okay, what we're going to move on to is, in addition, there's one more, we'll move on back a little bit to Eruv. In a certain mavoy, and this is going to bring us, we're always moving backwards and forwards. In a certain alleyway, there was an idolater named Lachman bar Ristak, and he absolutely refused to lease his home to Jews. He didn't want them carrying in the alley, and he understood that he had a certain amount of power to restrict that. So a nice idolater, for instance, would allow Yaakov to come and lease his house for Shabbat. And then the house belongs temporarily to Yaakov, and Yaakov can join the Eruv or the Mavoy. Everyone's happy. But Lachman refuses to do this. And they came and tell Abaye, what should we do? This is really causing a problem for us in the courtyard, in the alleyway. No one can carry. And Abaye comes up with a solution. Again, the rabbis are very good at the backdoor solutions. And his solution is as follows. Go and relinquish your rights in the Mavoy in favor of one Jew. In other words, let's say there are 15 Jewish families, one idolater family, and he basically says, go and all of you relinquish your rights to that one Jew, so at least you maintain some control over the alleyway. Because if it's one Jew and one idolater, we don't take the idolater into consideration. The Jew can stick up an Eruv in the alleyway, and now he can possibly invite guests over. He can create perhaps a community within his own home, in his own courtyard, that will give some flexibility, certainly to at least one Jew. Even if it's only about making sure there's Jewish presence in the alleyway, that's enough. And there might be some backdoor solutions to allowing others to use the alleyway if they kind of piggyback onto the one Jew who is left standing, right? He's the only one who now owns space in the alleyway. Everyone else has relinquished their rights. So again, this is an interesting insight, how to work with recalcitrant neighbors, right? There are backdoors we can use. We're moving on now to Daf 64. Another interesting possibility for how Jews and non-Jews can coexist when the idolater refuses to relinquish rights. Rava basically says, go make friends with him. Go make friends with your non-Jewish neighbor. So much so that when you say to him, can I put something in your garage? Can I store something there? Essentially, you gain some access or agency over the garage, and then you can, instead of the idolater, be a partner for the idolater, right? By having a friendship, which again is so lovely, make friends rather than enemies. And if you make friends, then you're going to be like an employee to the idolater, and then you have a certain amount of right over his property, in which case you won't need to lease from the idolater, and this Jew can then essentially contribute to the Eruv in the name of the idolater's property. So again, I'm just showing different mechanisms that I think are particularly interesting that allow for cooperation, living one with the other, make friends. What a good idea, right? Rather than antagonism like with this guy Lachman. Now the Gemara goes into a totally different, really, I think, very relevant space about drinking, okay? Drinking wine. The question is, what role or what impact does wine have on us? And I want to, as we go through some of the sources, I'm going to share with you a conversation I had with my sister this week, which will certainly reflect contemporary discourse and relevance. Okay, so the Gemara basically starts talking about if you get drunk, you should not daven, you should not pray. It's inappropriate to pray when you daven. And in fact, if you pray while you're drunk, your prayers are considered an abomination. Okay, so you really need to separate. No one's telling you not to drink, but you have to be aware that drink does not contribute to a spiritual relationship with God. They then go into, now, I want to pause and say that Rav Nachman then says, but if I don't drink at least something, I can't really give clear halachic rulings. So again, I love this because sometimes you need a drink. Sometimes you need a drink to relax at the end of the day. Sometimes you need a drink to kind of clear your head. And what you have here is tension between drinking anything, right? A revius of wine, which is very, very little, and you shouldn't render halachic decisions and you shouldn't pray. And Rav Nachman, who pipes up and says, until I drink a revius of wine, which is a glass of wine, my mind is not clear, right? And so interesting, right? They allow both voices. There is no absolute condemnation of wine. They're drinking wine all the time in the way we drink water. On the other hand, they want to raise awareness that wine can certainly have an impact on the way we interact with one another, with the Torah, with prayer, with halachic rulings. And it continues for quite a long time. And I'm actually going to skip a number. Give me a moment. In addition to many discussions about how much wine and what kind of wine, they also comment that exercise or walking it off, right? If you walk a certain amount, you can free yourself from the influence of wine. And one of the last pieces I want to share with you is one. Give me one moment. It talks about the idea that people are held accountable when they're drunk. That when people drink and they buy and sell and then wake up the next day, you have to be accountable, right? A drunk's purchase is a valid purchase. His sale is a valid sale. If he committed a sin for which there is a death sentence, they put him to death, and so on and so forth. In other words, we hold him accountable even when he's drunk. This is a big conversation today about how accountable people are when they're drunk. And then the Gemara says something astonishing. But what if he gets as drunk as Lot? If you remember the story in Lot, it's in Lech Lecha, not this week, next week's Parsha, also Noah. You have two stories in which men are so drunk that they have no idea that they're being taken advantage of. Very unusual. And they acknowledge if you are as drunk as Lot, blackout drunk, that you don't know when your daughter lies down with you and gets up, you are patur mikulam. And I have to say, I am very aware of the sensitivity. I mean, even the fact that I'm suggesting, right? What happens when you have a man and a woman who get, in college, this happens unfortunately all the time, blackout drunk. And in the morning, someone wakes up and says, I was taken advantage of, I didn't consent. Can there be consent when you've reached the level of intoxication of Lot? And the Gemara basically says, until that point, yes, you're absolutely accountable. You have consent. If you do something, you're accountable for it criminally and financially and so on. And there is a point where you are no longer accountable. Now, you're accountable for perhaps letting yourself get that drunk. But when you're that drunk, you might even be in a situation where you don't know what is happening and when someone lies down and when someone gets up. And what happens if two people are in that scenario? You buy and sell a house and the buyer and the seller are in that situation. Or a crime is committed and both people in the situation, the one who was assaulted and the assailant, are that drunk. That is complicated. And those are some of the questions and stories that are coming up today. And my sister Edith and I had a conversation about a book she read. And I said to her the next day, oh my God, look what the Gemara said, right? Here, there seems to be a difference between very drunk and going beyond that to blackout drunk, where like Lot, like Noah, you don't know what's happening. So there's always something in the Gemara that I find really does reflect issues going on in the days of our lives. Okay, I'm going to go on because I want to share with you more of the insights that have to do with things that are relatable. I'm going to skip some of the more technical conversations. I will say that there are a lot of questions about, I'm just going to show you a picture so we can see a little bit what's going on in Daf Yomi. Right. So here, by the way, is an example. I've got a Jew, a non-Jew, right there in the back in the inner courtyard, and a Jew. And the question is there any way for them to create an Eruv that allows them to carry if the non-Jew refuses to lease his house? And so we saw a little bit how to handle it. First of all, there's a position, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, one non-Jew has no impact on the rights of the Jews in the courtyards. Okay, so that's one idea. Another possibility is that you become friendly enough with the non-Jew that you're able to lease his house from him. And in the course of this discussion, they come up with a very antagonistic comment that, they ask, why would a Jew live alone in a courtyard with a non-Jew? And they talk about because not idolaters are suspected of murdering Jews, right? Again, there's a lot of fear of idolaters and physical violence. And they come up with the idea, but if there's even one other Jew around, it will deter him. He'll be afraid of being caught. No one wants to be caught, even in this bizarre scenario where we have the idolater living essentially door to door with the Israelites. So that's another little snippet that comes up in the discussion. Okay, I'm going to skip to 66. Hold on one moment. Okay, 65, yes. I will just, before we leave the drinking conversation completely, they have side conversations about what distracts them, the rabbis, from rendering legal decisions. And I just want to share you that it's not just wine, right? Wine obviously distracts you. Abaye says when his mother asks him to pass him food, something called kutak. And I thought, oh my God, what distracts us? When I'm sitting down trying to work, the smell of food certainly is distracting, no matter how concentrated I want to be. And Rava says lice distracts me. Well, I think we can understand lice, even the idea of lice, vermin, mice, certainly distracting. And as a result, the mother of Mar made him 7 sets of clothing. So anytime he thought he had lice, he could just change into a new set of clothing. What a lovely sensitivity on the part of the mother, right? These little snippets of very personal fears, anxieties, distractions. And then a little bit further on, they talk about smells. Shmuel says he can't pray in a house where there's beer, not because of the drinking of beer, because of the smell, the heavy smell of beer. Rav Papa says he can't pray, he can't daven when someone has fried fish. Again, so interesting. So we use as a jumping off point, real halachic conversation about wine. You cannot drink, you cannot daven when you drink. That's the halachic conversation. And then it ripples out to all sorts of, kind of internal thoughts. Well, what distracts me? What prevents me from davening? Strong smells. Shmuel's father couldn't daven for 3 days after a journey. Wow, I could relate to that. Jet lag is really tough, right? And so these very human moments, these voices that chime into the Gemara, that remind us that they're human beings, and that yes, wine is the larger conversation, right? Can you daven if you're drunk? But really on a micro conversation, so many things can distract us. How do we create spaces in which we're not going to be distracted, and so that we can daven and we can render halachic discussions? The last part of that, just to finalize it, Adam nikar bikoso, bikiso, ubikaso. We know that. That's such a common statement A person is known by how he handles his wine, how he handles his money, how he handles his anger. And there's one more add-on. We all know that. I shouldn't say we all, but many of us know that. That's a famous midrashic statement. His laughter, how he laughs, what kind of laugh he has. And again, there's so much truth to that statement, how we evaluate character. Okay. I'm just pausing for a moment. I want to skip some of the more technical conversations. What I want to talk about next comes up later in the Gemara. I mean, it's still within our weekly roundup, and I'll pause there for a moment. It has to do with what do we do with a non-Jew who does not, a non-religious Jew who does not keep Shabbos, right? How do we classify him? What is the classification? Is he like an idolater or not? And this conversation actually goes on for several pages. How do we handle people who are not religious? And what is the status of Mechalelei Shabbat? I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And so I want to just share with you some of the thoughts that come up before we go back to some vignettes about how we handle a child who needs hot water on Shabbat in the courtyard. So we're going to go back to some vignettes about Chatzera. Because we talked about, personal thoughts on distraction, I want to share with you also some of the thoughts that come up, the way they're going to relate to what's called a mumar, someone who does not keep Shabbat. And there's a lot of tension there, because on one hand, someone who's a mumar, someone who is mechalel Shabbat b'faresia, right? Someone who publicly desecrates Shabbat is considered equivalent to someone who worships idols. And how do we handle that, right? And what do we do if they live in our courtyard? And can we allow them to participate in the Eruv? Do we have to lease rights from them? I already mentioned some of this. This comes up. And so there really is a difference of opinion whether someone who is Mechalel Shabbat is considered like an idolater. Not everyone agrees. There's a difference of opinion. The last statement is that someone who does not keep Shabbat, who makes idolatrous wine libations, and so on, is considered to be equivalent to someone who violates all the areas of Jewish law. And so Shabbat, here we are in a tractate that is largely around Shabbat. There is a whole discussion. There's a moment where you think they're going to be a little more lenient. And I would suggest, because there are Jews who aren't keeping Shabbat, just like there are Jews who don't keep Shabbat today, how stringently are we going to regard these Jews? Are we going to outcast them essentially? Are we going to classify them with Ovdei Avodah Zarah, with idolaters? The end result is we do. That has impact for us today, but largely we live among many Jews who don't keep Shabbat, and there has also been a softening, right? Even as the stringencies from this page of Talmud continue to be reflected, sometimes with how we handle wine touched by non-religious Jews, although thank God there are leniencies in that area and not just stringencies, but a lot of the language that a mumar who is Mechalel Shabbat is like a goy, is like a nochri, continues to be present in modern day tshuvas, and painfully so in some ways. And so sometimes you have to look for poskim, contemporary authorities who are willing to go softer. But I just want to point out the hard position, the hard line position is coming from our Gemara in this weekly roundup, right? That's where the stage is set for treating Shabbat violators as idolaters, and that has tremendous repercussions. And as I said, there is machloket. It's not absolute. In the end, it becomes what's called a shma mina. That's it. There's nothing to do. That is what we are going to accept as law, and there's very little wiggle room. I want to segue to a story. It comes up on, I think it's 69. We've already moved quite a bit. I want to talk about a child who is born on Shabbat and needs to, is being circumcised on Shabbat. Hold on one moment. Yes. And the water to bathe the child spills. The hot water to bathe the child spills. And the problem is, I'm going to show you the drawing. Rava has hot water, but he lives in a different courtyard. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Hold on. Yeah, okay. So here we have this is Rava's house. There's a men's section and a women's section. The women live interesting, in Rava's house, the women lived more inside. They had the inner rooms and the men had the outer rooms, presumably for modesty's sake. He has a barrel of hot water, which is how he stored his hot water on Shabbat. He has a courtyard, and in the next courtyard, there is a baby who has been circumcised, and the hot water to bathe the baby has spilled. I'm already going to pause. Many of you are going to say, wait a minute, pikuach nefesh, right? In Shabbat, I think it might be chapter 18 or 19, there is a discussion that hot water on the day of circumcision is essential to clean the wound. In this particular page of Talmud, they don't see it as life-threatening. I want to say that. If it was life-threatening, this wouldn't be an issue. We're talking about rabbinic law. And so what Rava does is he moves all of his toiletries and his vessels into the women's quarter, and he is mevatel, he relinquishes his rights to the courtyard, people in this courtyard to come and take hot water. That's how he handles it. What I want to share with you is a question that the Gemara asks, why is it that Rava doesn't have an Eruv? And then it turns out that Rava and Abaye another. I asked the question in the same courtyard, how is it that two illustrious scholars live side by side and they didn't create an Eruv? How could this be? So Abaye answers as follows, and in his answer, again, I think you'll hear interesting both psychology and complex. Abaye says, obviously Rava didn't go around collecting bread from the neighbors. Rava is the head of the academy. That would be demeaning to Rava. So he left it for me. Here's the problem, says Abaye. No one wanted to give me bread. They didn't really care. And I am so poor that if I put 7 pieces of bread into a corner and one of the neighbors, and I do it for everybody, and I say this bread I am designating for everyone as a gift and so on. If the guy next door comes and says, give me the piece of bread that you designated for me, Abaye says, I can't afford to do that because this is my week's worth of bread. And I can't give up a piece and with integrity create an Eruv for the entire courtyard, because to do so would be to use bread that I need, that my family needs, and I have to be willing to give it up to the Shabbos and say, oh, give me my part of the Eruv. Oh, you did an Eruv for me? Great, give me a piece of bread, right? Wow. So many questions come up for me. How, this kind of poverty, this kind of vulnerability, right? How am I going to be able to make an Eruv for everyone and no one else cares, and yet I can't do it with integrity? And so the story goes on. As with many things in the Talmud, it's a brief insight into the complexity of 2 Torah scholars. One is so great that he can't possibly be engaged in the mundane details of creating an Eruv. The other one is so poor that he can't in good conscience create an Eruv with no one helping him, because he can't really share that food with the neighbors, which is what you're really required to do for it to be an Eruv Chatzera. So again, it really reveals to us, complexity among neighbors. Why are the other neighbors not aware of Abaye's plight? Why are they not stepping up and making sure Abaye and Rava, the 2 stages of the generation, can carry on their Chatzer? Rava comes up with this solution. He needs a solution because he wants to get hot water to the baby. It's a great halachic solution, but it certainly leaves us wondering a little bit why it had to come to this. And so that is a little bit about what happened on that page. Okay, so that's the story with the baby. There's another story where they talk about another possibility. They bring another incident with an 8-day-old baby. The hot water spilled. We want to bathe the baby. And they say, look, let's ask his mother, because a birthing woman after birth, even a week after birth, who needs hot water, is considered as a patient in danger. And so they say, let's ask his mother. And if she needs it, we'll get a non-Jew to heat the water. Because in this case, no one has a barrel of stored water. She's already cholesh sheyesh ba sakana, a patient with danger. And we'll get the non-Jew to heat some water. So Rav Misharshia, and this is again, to me, a little humorous, says to Rava, but she's eating dates. In other words, how sick can she be? She's sitting up in bed and eating some dates. Really, Rava, are we going to go all out for her just because you want to make sure she can bathe the baby? Like, what are you doing? What kind of game are you playing? And Rava smacks him upside the head, so to speak, and says, you know, what are you telling me? She obviously was struck by a stupor. She went a little crazy. Eating dates 8 days after birth, that's not typical behavior on the part of a birthing woman. She's obviously a little sick, it's gotten to her head. She's stupor. She's so sick, she doesn't even know what she's eating because she never would be eating dates. And so again, he rejects the attempt to torpedo his back door. Rav Misharshia is saying, seriously, 8 days later, you're going to boil water on Shabbos with a non-Jew? You're going to let us do that? She's eating dates. She feels fine. No, says Rava, I'm not accepting that. I'm going to err on stringency towards pikuach nefesh, right? I don't care what you're telling me. I don't care what you're describing. 8 days after birth, this woman, regardless of how she's behaving, is still in the category of danger, and bathe the baby also with the rest of the hot water, right? That is a classic Talmudic solution, and very much reflective of many halachic decisions, how halacha functions with that kind of ingenuity. It can be frustrating that it doesn't always reflect reality, right? That's what Rav Misharshia is trying to say. Rav, the reality is she's eating dates. And Rav is like, yeah, no, the reality doesn't really matter. Maybe she's a little crazy. 8 days after birth, she's still cholesh sheyesh ba sakana. That's still her category, and bathe the baby, right? So that's very much how halacha often functions. Okay, we're going to move on to, I think we're up to 69. Second. Okay, this is where what I want to actually move towards is the last two daf. I want to give us a little time to look at the last two daf. Oh, great. Okay, so now we're ready to look at the next Mishnah. We'll look at it quickly because these Mishnahs are quite long, just to give you a sense of what's happening in the Gemara where we've moved. We finished discussing our Mishnah. It ends with the discussion about the Tzadukite and the, as we said, the Tzaduki and so on, and we took care of that. And now we're up to the next Mishnah. Me'ematai nonim reshut. Well, can you all see the Mishnah? Are you in Sfaria? Did Sfaria come up? Okay, great. Me'ematai nonim reshut. Beit Shammai omrim miboja. Well, when do you actually have to relinquish your share in the courtyard? Well, Beit Shammai says before Shabbos. Now, by the way, if it's before Shabbos, then why not just join the Eruv, right? So Beit Shammai doesn't really make sense, but Beit Shammai sees you're relinquishing your right as a form of kinyan, of what's called acquisition. You're giving an acquisition to your house, to your courtyard, to the other people in the courtyard. So you can't do that on Shabbos. Beit Hillel omrim meshachashecha. Don't be ridiculous. The whole idea of bitul, of relinquishing your rights, is for someone who forgot to join the Eruv. We want to have a back door. The back door is on Shabbos. It gets dark and he smacks himself on the head and says, oh my God, I forgot to join the Eruv. Bitul. So Beit Hillel does not see it as a kinyan, as an acquisition. He sees it as istaluke reshuta. He's removing permission from himself to use the courtyard. And you can do that on Shabbos. Of course you can. He's essentially restricting himself, but there's no acquisition going on. Okay, so that's Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai. Misha chashecha. Misha natan reshuto v'hotzi. Someone who gave away his share in the courtyard. Ben b'shogeg, ben b'mezi. Let's say I relinquished my right, Erev Shabbos, on Shabbos, whenever. And then I start carrying into the courtyard, whether I do it deliberately or accidentally. Harei oser. Rabbi Meir says, you've taken away your bitul. Rabbi Yehuda omer b'mezid oser. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, only if you do it willfully, deliberately, lahachis, angrily. B'shogeg and oser. If you accidentally forgot and carried into the courtyard, you do not relinquish your bitul. this comes to the question, and we saw it with the Tzaduki earlier. Can someone take back their bitul? I relinquished my right, Shabbos, and then I take it back. Now none of you can carry, ha ha ha, right? So it seems to suggest that if you really want to be malicious and do that, there's a split in opinion whether we allow you to renege on your bitul. There's actually a whole Talmudic discussion. Rabbi Meir says whether you relinquish it willingly or willfully or accidentally, meaning either you take back your relinquishing, that's it, it's over for everyone else in the courtyard. Rabbi Yehuda says only if you do it b'mezid, and there's a third opinion that says you can't take it back. Once you relinquish, it's over. Like Rabbi Gamliel's father, get into the courtyard before the tzadukite gets in there and regrets his relinquishing. And so that's going to come up. How do we handle people acting either maliciously or forgetfully? Does that ruin it for everybody? Okay, and the last Mishnah, before we finish, we round up. Well, I have a householder who was in partnership with his neighbor during the week. Partnership in wine, biyayin, and yayin. So I have two neighbors, one on either side. We share a courtyard or we share an alleyway, doesn't matter. And we have a partnership. The Mishnah looks at this as if we all own the courtyard. In other words, our partnership is significant enough. Einam tzrichim la'arev. We don't even need an eruv. We are one happy partnership. We are one happy family. Lezeh yayin v'lezeh shemen. What happens if your wine over here and oil over here? So it's not the same food item. So it's not one happy partnership. One partnership here, one partnership there, but then maybe you have to have an eruv because the partnership isn't equal to like unity, right? You have unity here, but the three of you aren't in unity. Tzrichim la'arev. You need an eruv. Rabbi Shimon Omer, achad zeh ve'achad zeh inam tzrichim la'arev. Rabbi Shimon basically says if you have partnerships with your neighbors, you don't need an eruv. Essentially, the partnership stands in for the eruv. Again, very nice idea. So before we end, I just want to summarize some of what's going on around discussion that's going on around these two Mishnahs. The first is what happens if on Shabbos someone dies and their son automatically inherits? Does that prevent the people? Again, the father took part in the eruv. He dies. Now his son is immediately now the owner of his home. That's the way it works. He immediately inherits. Do we look at the son as kind of a purchaser, someone who acquires and as a result cannot join the eruv? Or, says the Gemara, and this is very beautiful, has he essentially simply replaced his father? And then he literally steps into his father's shoes. And there's no reason for him actively to do bitol or join the eruv. He essentially has become his father in the wake of his father's death, which is such a, both of the ideas are real, right? The idea that, when a parent dies, there's acquisition, right? There's the will and there's the home and there's the inheritance and so on. But on a much bigger level, what do you leave behind, right? The child steps into and continues the legacy of the parent, certainly in ideal situations. And if that's the model we're looking at, says the Gemara, the continuation of the father's life directly through the children he leaves behind and the son who inherits in this case, then there's no reason for him to restrict the members of the chatzer, of the courtyard, because he essentially becomes his father. His father is being continued immediately, seamlessly upon death with the son stepping in. And of course, there's so much we could do there and talk about there, about continuity and the relationship of children and then grandchildren in the aftermath of death. And the last idea I want to leave with you with, which what happens in this last Mishnah is it seems as if there are different ways, all these back doors. And I just want to share one complaint, one concern Rabbi Meir has. Rabbi Meir basically says, I hear what you're saying. I hear that there are lots of ways in which we can get around eruv. There are all these back doors. There's bitul, and then there's the nochri, and if he dies, and if he doesn't die, all sorts of complex scenarios that emerge and conversations that come up. But Rabbi Meir asks a very good question. He says, basically, what I understand is you need an Eruv or a Shituf. It's after a whole discussion. It doesn't look like you actually need both. The rabbis decide you don't need an Eruv Chatzerot and a Shituf Mavolot. One should be enough. And Rabbi Meir then says, if you do this, and throughout the Gemara this comes up, if you allow this leniency, this back door, this no need for an Eruv, just do a Shituf, then he says, in order, what is going to happen to the children? The children are not going to know how to make an Eruv. All they're going to grow up with is the leniencies. They're not going to know that these leniencies are stand-ins for Eruvs and Shitufs. And basically what he says is, even if you can, you shouldn't, in order not to cause the institution of Eruv to be forgotten from the children, who would say our fathers did not make an Eruv. And the Gemara, before we go on to the next Mishnah, which we did not get to, it's in the next daf, it's in tomorrow's page, tomorrow's daf. The halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and then Rav Huna says, no, it doesn't. The custom follows the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Nahagu ha'am Rabbi Meir. People are accustomed to following his opinion, right? And in this case, Rabbi Meir's concern is that sometimes when we have too many backdoors and too many leniencies, an entire institution can be forgotten. Educationally, we have to think about the consequence, the bigger picture of sometimes only thinking small. How do I use the chatzer? How do I use the shituf? How do I use the mavli, right? Sometimes by finding too many loopholes, we can lose an entire structure for a generation, and then that obviously will be lack of continuity. Children will not step into their father's shoes, right? That whole concept will be lost. So I'm going to leave you here. We've done a lot. I hope you're not too exhausted. Rest after. But we hopefully have seen a lot of the beautiful discussions that go on, even intertwined and embedded in very technical discussions about a chatzer inside a chatzer and a mavo and how many doorways and how many courtyards. There's always what to find on these pages that really can illuminate the days of our lives. Thank you very much. And you're welcome to correspond with me on email, nechamabarash@gmail.com, or through Matan. I'm sorry I have to go. Sion has to lock up and I want to be considerate. And I hope I'll see you next week. Thank you.